What if the war never ended for you? The Philippines, the year 1945. The world is celebrating victory, but in the jungles of Lubang Island, a Japanese soldier is hiding from the enemy. He doesn't believe in surrender. He's waiting for an order, and that order he will receive only 30 years later. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, a man who fought alone until 1974, believing he was doing his duty. A story of loyalty, madness, and the price of conviction. March 1974. Philippines. Dense jungle thickets of the island of Lubang. A man in a shabby military uniform emerges from the foliage. On his shoulder is a rifle. He is emaciated, haggard, but upright. He approaches a group of Filipino soldiers, takes off his rifle, and surrenders. It's almost the end of the 20th century. Mankind is flying into space. Japan is an economic miracle. The world has long since healed the wounds of World War II. But this man is still fighting. He is convinced that the war is not over. His name is Hiroo Onoda, the emperor's last soldier, a man who has lived almost 30 years in the jungle, hiding, fighting, killing, avoiding enemy propaganda. This story is not about madness. It's not about paranoia. It's not about chance. It is a story of duty, faith, resilience, and loneliness, which become immortal when the rest of the world gives up on them. He was born in Japan in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture. His father was a former soldier who died in the Chinese campaign. From childhood, Onoda was brought up in a spirit of absolute loyalty to the emperor, like most Japanese boys of the time. As a teenager, he learnt Chinese and worked for a trading company. But when war broke out, he volunteered for the army. His path led him to the Imperial Army's elite scout school, where he learnt sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and survival alone. He wasn't just a soldier. He was trained as a long-term agent, able to exist behind enemy lines for months, even years, without support. In 1944, as the Allies approached the Philippines, Onoda was given a special assignment to go to the island of Lubang and organize resistance, not to surrender under any circumstances. A clear order. You must not die. You must continue to fight until the emperor orders otherwise. Onoda takes it literally. When the Americans land on Lubang, he goes into the jungle. With him are 3 other soldiers. Together they become an invisible unit, raiding, destroying enemy supplies, holding the defenses. Many years after the official end of the war. World War II ends in August of 1955. Japan surrenders. Emperor Hirohito speaks on the radio, announcing the cessation of hostilities. For everyone except Onoda. On Lubanga, in the thicket, he doesn't hear the radio broadcast. He doesn't get the order. And when leaflets are dropped on the island announcing the surrender, he decides it's enemy disinformation. He and his comrades are convinced the war is still going on. The empire is alive. The leaflets are a ruse. The newspapers are fake. Thus begins a ghost war that will last another 29 years. Onoda and his 3 companions settled in the mountains of the island. They fed on whatever they could find: bananas, coconuts, dead cows from farms. They ambushed the Philippine police, thinking they were collaborators. They took machetes, ammunition, clothes from the enemy. They couldn't be caught because they knew the jungle better than anyone. They were feared. The locals called them ghosts of the mountains. In 1919, one of them surrenders. In 1995, another one is killed. In 1972nd, Onoda's last comrade, Kosuke, is killed in a firefight. And now, Onoda is alone. But he doesn't give up. He still believes that the war is going on, that the enemy has simply changed shape, that the emperor is waiting, and that surrender is a betrayal. He becomes a legend. Some people laugh. Others admire him. The newspapers publish articles. Japanese man who doesn't know the war is over. Japan dumps photos of Onoda's relatives on Lubang. Letters. Radio broadcasts. But he's sure it's a trick to break their spirits. He doesn't believe it. He keeps fighting. By the early 1970s, Hiroo Onoda was known all over the world. He was mentioned in newspapers, on the radio, in reports, but it was all to no avail. Onoda remained in the jungle like a lost samurai, surrounded by a modernity he did not recognize. Then a man appeared who changed everything. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a young Japanese traveler, 24 years old. He set off on a journey through Southeast Asia with a goal: to find Onoda. It sounded like madness. He's not a military man, not a diplomat, not an intelligence agent, just a romantic, a dreamer, in love with an idea. But that's exactly the kind of man who got through to Onoda. In 1974, Hiroo landed on the island of Lubang. He went round the villages, talked to the locals, and after a few weeks, he found the trail. He left letters for Onoda, food, radio, and finally, he made contact. The first meeting was tense. Onoda came out of the thicket with a rifle. He was suspicious, withdrawn, exhausted, but attentive. He didn't believe Onuki's words, but he sensed that the man was not lying. For the first time in decades, Onoda had doubts. Hiroo returned to Japan and asked the government to find the officer who had given the order to Onoda. Tell him to personally order him to stop fighting. Such an officer was found. His name was Major Taniguchi. He'd long since retired. He worked in a bookshop, but when he heard about the fate of his former subordinate, he agreed. Taniguchi arrived on the island accompanied by journalists and officials. He was met by a man in a ragged uniform, carrying a rifle, loaded, in good working order, ready for battle. He was Hiroo Onoda, a senior lieutenant in the Imperial Army. He saluted and listened to the order. Taniguchi said, "The Empire has surrendered. The war is over. You are relieved of your duties." Onoda nodded silently, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, he lowered his weapon. He stepped out of the jungle, before the eyes of the world. Hiroo Onoda arrived in Japan in the spring of 1974. He was greeted in his homeland as a national hero and as a living artifact of the past. Thousands of people applauded him. The government presented honors. The emperor sent official recognition of service. But inside, Onoda did not feel triumphant. He said, "I arrived in Tokyo, and it was not a city to me. It was another world. I looked at the people, and I didn't know them. They were not the Japanese I knew. They were strangers." He didn't understand the culture, the language, the slang. He didn't know what a TV, microwave records were. He lived in a different era. Journalists begged him to tell them how he survived. He answered simply, "I was in the service. I had no right to give up." He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a soldier who obeyed orders. Onoda wrote a book. He spoke at universities, but he soon realized he couldn't live in this society. Everything he'd fought for was gone. The Japanese army was disbanded. The youth listened to rock. The emperor became a symbol. In 1995, Onoda went to Brazil. He started a farm there. He lived in silence, away from television, newspapers, and memories. But years later, he returned to start a survival school for teenagers. He taught the kids discipline, willpower, respect. And he said, "The world forgets quickly, but duty lives longer." He died in 2004, aged 81. But to the end, he never said he was sorry. Because for him, it was simple. I was a Japanese soldier. I received an order, and I carried it out. When Hiroo Onoda's name was splashed across the newspapers, the world was divided into two camps. One called him a hero, a symbol of fortitude, a samurai of the 20th century, a warrior who didn't betray his oath, didn't break, didn't give up. He was respected for his principle, for his courage, for his absolute faith. Others saw him as a fanatic, a man who lived outside of time, outside of reality, who killed for nothing, who refused to accept the obvious, who gave up humanity in the name of illusion. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Because Onoda wasn't just a soldier. He was a product of an era where honor is above life, where the emperor is a god, where orders are non-negotiable. He grew up in Japan before Hiroshima, before democratization, before the loss of the sacred core. He believed, because he couldn't do otherwise. But how can a modern man understand this? Because today, freedom of thought is a value. Back then, it didn't exist. Loyalty was a form of life, and that's why Onoda became a mirror that's scary to look into. He showed what happens when a man believes too much, when duty becomes eternal, when an order never ends, even if it's given to be forgotten. But maybe that's what strength is? Onoda came out of the jungle in the year 1974. The same year, the first personal computer was released in the United States. The Winter Olympics were held in Japan. The film The Godfather 2 was released. The British band Queen released Killer Queen. The world had changed beyond recognition. And Onoda, still wearing his Imperial Army uniform, stitching up an old rifle and believing the war was going on. He had become an anomaly, a living artifact. But more importantly, he became a question. What would you do? Would you surrender? Would you starve to death? Would you try to escape? Would you believe a leaflet dropped from an aeroplane? Or would you have survived? Would he fight? Would he have stayed loyal? Where is the line between courage and stubbornness, between loyalty and obsession, between honor and not being able to live any other way? His story isn't about Japan. It's not about World War II. It's not even about the war. It's about a man who finds himself alone in a world that no longer exists. And he didn't go mad. He made a decision to be a soldier until the end, until he gets his orders. He said, "I'm part of the army, and the army is not you. It's a duty. It's an extension of the will of the nation. If you stop being a part, you're no longer alive." And that sounds creepy, but it's also fascinating. We live in a world where everything changes, where vows are made by the hour, where faith is rare. And Onoda showed us that there are people who don't let go, who go all the way. Because if they don't, they lose themselves. Onoda was called the last samurai, although he didn't wield a samurai sword, but he had spirit. like a warrior who goes all the way, even if it leads to death. So the question is, does the world hate people like Onoda? Or does it admire them? Onoda became an uncomfortable figure. He showed that duty can be worse than death, that truth is not always kind, that faith can be cruel. But without such men, history would be flat. Without them, we wouldn't know where the limit is. He showed us that limit. When Hiroo Onoda died in 1944, Japan was a different country. But his funeral was attended by veterans, survival school students, politicians, ordinary people, and many cried. Because with him went an era, the last soldier, the last warrior, the last of those who believed so strongly that they were ready to forget everything but the oath. And here's the big question for us. If the war were over, and you were left alone, in the woods, with orders to hold the defense, would you surrender? Or would you continue to fight for 29 years, not knowing that the whole world had gone on ahead? Thank you for watching to the end. Share this video and write in the comments, would you be able to surrender if the oath still had you by the throat?